right now on Higher Journeys Radio with Alexis Brooks. Over the years, the field of UFO research has seen its fair share of dips and curves, ebbs and flows, from all-out ridicule and dismissal to the inevitability of eventual disclosure. The doors of the ET and UFO phenomenon are poised to be blown wide open. One individual who has seen and been integral to it all is international UFO researcher, author, and publisher Philip Mantle. For nearly 40 years, Philip has probed virtually every aspect of this elusive but revelatory subject. A former director of investigations for the British UFO Research Association and former MUFON representative for England, Philip has acknowledged that there has been a great shift in how the UFO subject is both viewed as well as experienced. Today we're discussing a most intriguing account that he has long researched and eventually went on to publish, and that's the fascinating ET abduction story of Calvin Parker, which took place in Pascagoula, Mississippi in 1973. Philip had a lot to say about this incredible account and the UFO phenomenon overall. Let's listen in to what he had to share. Philip, you've been knocking on the door of this field we call ufology for nearly 40 years, 1979. So I think it's fair to say you are truly a pioneer in this work. So first of all, I want to say kudos for all you've added to this broad and complex subject. And thank you for joining us today on Higher Journeys.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Alexis. Yeah,
excellent.
Been involved for nearly 40 years. Makes me sound like I'm really old, doesn't it?
Well, I think you got another long run to go. So, and based on the conversation that we just had a moment ago, you've got a lot more to do, and a lot more is going on. So, we're happy that you're a part of this field. Well, listen, I want to start out by asking you, in those 40 years, have you seen any significant shift in the approach to understanding this mystery we call the ET UFO phenomenon? In other words, have the entry points changed or expanded in your estimation at all?
I think there's a number of things happened. I mean, I think now in general terms, the mass media do tend to take it a lot more seriously than they used to do. Yes, there are still, the usual channels that will poke fun at it and so on. But I think down the years, because people like the late Dr. John Mack became involved, a Harvard professor, then from the UK, we had Nick Pope, the man from the Ministry of Defence. So when people like that become involved, it does tend to make people think twice when originally they might have dismissed it out of hand. Mm-hmm. Because these are serious people doing serious work. I mean, Mack, for example, as well, was a Pulitzer Prize winner, not for writing about this subject, but for other things he was involved in. And of course, every now and again, the media does take it seriously, which again influences public opinion. And we saw that at the end of last year in the New York Times.
Absolutely.
And I believe it was with their online version, it was their biggest read article ever.
Really?
I believe so. Online. I'm not talking about, the paper version. I'm talking about the hits that it actually received online. I think I'm right in saying it had more hits than anything they'd ever published before. So, of course, that influences public opinion as well. And so, things have changed, as we know, Alexis. When I was involved, there was no internet. So the internet has its good and bad points. One of the things there used to be in the UK was a lot of regional research groups. Most of them have gone. However, then you have this great big thing called the internet. So it swings and roundabouts, really. So I think there certainly has been a change and a shift, and long may that continue.
I hope so. Well, of course, most of us, if not all of us listening to this program, will undoubtedly know about the precedent-setting, I guess we could say, article in the New York Times, as well as the Washington Post. I believe it was December 16th of last year. And, there have been some critics about the impact that it had on mass consciousness or the lack thereof. But either way, I would call that a demarcation point. And I think there have been several historically, and I think more are coming, not the least of which is the work that you're doing. So
I definitely think there's more coming from a wide variety of places. I mean, we've seen how much credence you put on them, but we've seen national governments in many different parts of the world make available their UFO files. We've done that here in the UK, and there's other countries around the world have done the same. And I'm sure there'll be more to follow. And I'm sure there'll be more to follow from those that were involved in the items we discussed from the New York Times. In fact, I've kept tabs on it, and they've given a whole host of hints that, what we've seen so far is not even the tip of the iceberg.
I agree. Yeah.
So I think next year, stay tuned.
There's another bombshell coming, you think?
I think there's something coming, but I don't know what. I don't have any inside information. I've just tried to follow little things that the gentleman, Mr. Elizondo, has said in public, and he's given lots of hints that that they are serious and what they say they can support and they can back up, and next year we're going to see a lot more. So here we go.
Well, of course, we're talking about To the Stars Academy, and Lord knows they have received a fair amount of criticism as well as commendation, I suppose. It's all over the map for whatever it's worth. I do think it's gotten the discourse to broaden a bit. So I'll be very interested to see what's happening there. We could obviously do a full show on that, but we're going to kind of bounce around a little bit. Thank you for that. That was great. And I'm sure we'll all be anxiously awaiting to see what might be hitting next. I agree with you, though. I think we've got some new epiphanies or revelations that may be happening. But let me ask you, Philip, have you changed your approach with investigating all this? I mean, we're talking about 4 decades. How have you, if you have, changed or broadened your approach to investigating this field?
Yeah, I don't think I've changed my approach that much. I mean, again, when I first began, I had this, burning desire to find out what this phenomena was for myself, for my own personal interest. I was always the type of person, and still am, that if you see a button that says don't press, I want to know what happened when you did press it, Right. And the same with the UFO. I was always interested in all things that we label as paranormal, as far back as I can remember, and I believe that may stem from my late mother. My mum was from Northern Ireland, and when she was young, they lived in a very rural setting, and she told me quite openly that she met a fairy. And talked to it. And I asked her down the years, was this real, Mum? She said, well, it seemed real to me. And she told my children, her grandchildren, the same story. So I always had a fascination for things of that nature. But of course, when I began in the late 1970s, there was no internet. So how did you obtain information about this? There wasn't a lot of books. There were some. There was your regional groups, and I joined one, quite fortunately, called the Yorkshire UFO Society. That's the county I'm from, is Yorkshire. And it was organised by 2 brothers, Graham and Mark Birdsall. Graham went on to publish UFO magazine, which was extremely successful. Sadly, he died rather suddenly a number of years back. But we were fortunate in those days, Alexis, because about an hour's drive from where we live, we have what's called the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Beautiful moorlands. Everybody in Yorkshire will tell you about it. But we weren't interested in it because of its beauty. We were interested because, for whatever reason, it was a hotbed of UFO sightings. And we were the regional group there at the time, and most of them used to come to us. And we literally had everything. So we did the usual things like sky watches and so on. Rather naively, perhaps we thought we could confront this phenomena face to face, up close and personal. And we certainly tried to do that. I believe I witnessed the phenomena one night on the moors, in the company of Graham Birdsall. So, and then, of course, the next thing was to try and interview the witnesses to these events, which we did. And we did all kinds of publicity to bring events in from all around the area. And what we learned from that, Alexis, was the fact that, yes, there was a spike in activity, but we got reports going back down the decades. And we also found that in these areas, the people call them all different kinds of things, window areas or, anomalous zones or portals or whatever. But whatever you want to call them, I mean, the Yorkshire Dales National Park, by American standards, is not huge,
Right.
But in this small area, we had reports of everything. I'll give you a little example. Mark Birdsall and I, we'd received a letter from a gentleman who lived in a small village in the park. So we phoned him up, made an appointment to go and interview him. And when we got there, what we'd call a village was just a number of houses. The houses didn't have any numbers on them. So how did we find him? So we just said, we'll knock on the door and somebody will know who this gentleman is. So a lady came to the door and I said, we're looking for Mr. So-and-so. And she said, have you come about the ghost dog? What's the ghost dog? And of course, there was the legend of these two red lights that floated through the village. And of course, that was the eyes of the ghost dog, But in reality, all they saw was these strange lights. We found out that witchcraft was still practiced in the area and a whole host of other things, just by chance. So these areas don't just have UFO sightings. They had a bit of everything you could think of.
Sure, yeah.
So things have changed down the years, of course, but I still think there's nothing better than interviewing people face to face. But the internet is a great resource because you can access things here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
But it's not the be all and end all as some people believe it to be.
Right.
So things have changed in that respect, and of course the phenomenon itself has changed, Alexis. If we look back to the 1940s, the very simple sightings, and then in the 50s we had the Space Brothers, and I often ask, where have the Space Brothers gone? And then in the 60s we had the first abduction with the Hills, or the first one that went on the record anyway, that we know the ones preceded that. And so nowadays, if you think about the Hill encounter, Betty and Barney Hill,
yes.
do we get that kind of thing now? I think it's the phenomenon has, I'll use this word, I don't know if it's the right word, but it's certainly evolved. It's certainly changed down the decades.
Right.
And why that is, I don't know.
Well, you're bringing up something really interesting that what comes to mind is a conversation I just recently had with Nick Redfern, another mutual colleague, not on the UFO phenomenon per se, but rather on other sort of non-human intelligence invasion and their connection to us. We were speaking particularly about the shadow being phenomenon. And where we ended up going, Philip, is talking about this the idea that the evolution, we brought this up as well, the evolution of the quality of the sightings and the different variables to these encounters may have something to do with the evolution of human consciousness as well. In other words, as I put it to him, do we have skin in the game? Is there some inextricable link between the phenomena that we're experiencing and ourselves? So it would seem to me, and we can't say this for sure, but I agree with you. It seems that over the years, the elements of the contact experience on a broader scale have changed. They have evolved. There have become more variations of them. What does that have to do with the big C word, consciousness, something that I'm sure 40 years ago, you and your colleagues probably weren't talking a lot about, I don't know. But
I think we talked about it, but not in this field.
Right.
We talked about consciousness in its own right. Mm-hmm. And I think more consciousness would come into the field in those days, perhaps when we looked at out-of-body experiences and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. Because there was, and probably still is, this idea that UFOs are there. You put them in their hole. The paranormal is there. That goes in another pigeonhole. And, the cryptids, that goes in another department. So even we were talking before we started recording of our late colleague, Bud Hopkins. Bud, I think it was in the MUFON Journal. I think he wrote an article called Stewpot Thinking, or something along those lines. In other words, there was an attempt to say that these phenomenon were all linked. There were different sides of the same coin, perhaps. Whereas Bud was not having any of that. He still wanted them put in their different pigeonholes.
Interesting.
So I think that's changed radically down the years when we're looking at the links between this, and as you mentioned, consciousness. I remember, I know we're digressing somewhat, but I remember reading one story about an out-of-body experience. A gentleman, was seriously ill. He was in his own room in the hospital, and he died. But what he didn't know is that at the time his wife was sat outside in the corridor waiting to see him. And of course the medical crew were working to save him, and they did revive him. But she didn't get to see him. He was too ill, and she'd actually bought a new hat for the occasion. So when she came in the next day, she wasn't wearing this hat, but he was aware of it because he'd gone up to the ceiling and he could see out through the window and look down on her and could see her new hat, which was amazing, So we did sort of look at consciousness, but not perhaps in the UFO realm.
Right.
But, that's not the case nowadays, of course.
No, I think that's changing, and I think I would dare say it is the elephant that's always been in the room. You've got people like Grant Cameron that are now resigned to speaking integrally, or speaking of consciousness in an integral fashion, and others. And some of the great work he's done, he's been able to dig up others that are have been notoriously linked to the field. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of school, but individuals that have been sort of on the covert side of the field in terms of the government cover-up, that have in private conversations admitted that the ESP aspect is integral to the contact phenomenon, to the UFO phenomenon at large. So I don't want to dig a hole I can't get out of here, but it is interesting and certainly worthy of a conversation in and of itself. But I want to go ahead, as I'm looking at the time, and segue into equally intriguing territory here. I want to talk about and really focus our discussion at this point on your latest work, and I'm smiling because it's just doing so incredibly well, published under your Flying Disc Press publishing company. This is the recently released book about the abduction account of Calvin Parker. And the book is called Pascagoula, the closest encounter, My Story, Calvin Parker. So, and I'll add that you also wrote the foreword to this amazing book. This is a fascinating account, guys. I'm talking to the audience now. Fascinating, of a man and his friend, sort of mentor, named Charles, who in 1973 on a fishing trip in Pascagoula, Mississippi, were both abducted. They were taken aboard craft and returned completely altered. Now, at first blush, you might think, as far as abduction stories are concerned, there's nothing vastly different about this particular account. But you found yourself having a great interest in retelling this story, Philip. Why did you decide to take this on? If you're enjoying this episode and want to get more conversations about all things intriguing, inspiring, and unusual, be sure to subscribe to Higher Journeys on YouTube. And once you do, don't forget to hit that notification bell to receive an announcement as soon as a new episode is posted. And now, back to our show.
Well, I remember reading about the Pascagoula case in a magazine article many years back, and it just seemed so different to anything else.
Okay.
And we start with the fact that there was two people. That at that time was rare. There was Betty and Barney Hill, but most encounters were of one person, and they were in an out-of-the-way location. Now, on the Pascagoula River, where Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson was, it's right next to Highway 90. You can see the bridge going over the river. It's not an out-of-the-way place. You can literally just walk right up to it.
Mm-hmm.
So there was cars passing. In fact, as they were driving into park, they passed another car that was already parked there. So it wasn't an out-of-the-way place. There were two people involved. Then you get a look at the creatures they encountered. Yes, they were humanoid, but they were the most bizarre-looking things you'd ever seen at the time. They were literally like something out of, I don't know if you watch it in the US, Doctor Who, and they didn't have any eyes or nose or mouth. They had pointed carrot-shaped things sticking out the side of their head and one out the front of the face. Their hands didn't have fingers. They were described as having mittens or looking like crab-like claws. Their legs stayed together. They didn't walk. And their skin looked like elephant skin, grey and wrinkly. And they didn't walk. They literally floated over the ground. If that wasn't curious enough, after all this had happened, what did these two gentlemen do? Well, first of all, they phoned the Air Force base that they knew was nearby. Charles Hickson had been a veteran of the Korean War. So they phoned Keesler Air Force Base. And they said, sorry, we don't investigate UFOs anymore. This was 1973. Project Blue Book had finished in 69.
Mm-hmm.
Keesler advised them to phone their local sheriff, so they did. Now, the sheriff's department said, stay there. We will come out and we will escort you in. So one of the first things that the deputy did when he got there, he gave them both what I think what you call in America is a sobriety test. Can you walk straight? Can you put your finger on your nose? I don't know what you do, but that was the first thing they did. And of course, there was nothing wrong. So they escorted them back to the sheriff's department. And both men were interviewed separately. And the police, didn't believe a word. So what they decided to do was put both Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker in a room together and left them alone. And there was a desk there. And about 5-10 minutes later, the deputy came back and he took something out of the desk drawer. They didn't know what it was. But unbeknown to them, they'd been secretly recorded. What he was taking out of the drawer was a cassette tape. They went and played that. And of course, on the cassette tape, they're still talking about what had happened to them and how they were going to tell their family. And, Calvin is almost on the verge of a breakdown. He was that scared.
Wow.
So that was unheard of. So the case itself had all these unique points to it. Then somebody, we've still never found out who, released this to the press. And they were literally bombarded by the media the very next day. I mean, literally, because what did they do the next day? They went back to work. So they worked at the local shipyard. And the press descended on it. Within 36 hours, the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek was there on site.
Wow, I didn't know that.
He'd flown down using his own money. He met up with Dr. James Harder, who was part of the group called APRO at the time. And Harder tried to hypnotize Calvin, couldn't do that. He hypnotized Charles Hickson slightly. And before Hynek flew back home to Illinois, he held a press conference saying that these two gentlemen were the real thing. Whatever the real thing is was still up to speculation, but he asked everyone to give them a fair hearing. And, down the decades, it actually became Hynek's favorite case.
Really?
Yeah, and I even recently I communicated with Hynek's son via email.
Mm-hmm.
And he's told me quite openly, he said, I remember, he said, I was around about 10 years old and the phone rang, and on my father's phone was not Calvin Parker, but Charles Hickson wanting to speak to my dad, on his private home telephone number. They were that close. So it was unique in a number of ways. I mean, 3 weeks after the event, Calvin Parker did end up having a breakdown.
He did. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what Calvin, both gentlemen were affected very, very differently. Calvin sort of became a drifter, didn't want to talk about it, and when people found out who he would finish his job and move on, But Charles Hickson was the opposite. He'd thought this was something special, something unique, and that we, mankind, should know about it. So he went on the Dick Cavett show. He went and lectured at church halls and UFO conventions. And then, so what happened is last year I got the permission to publish Charles Hickson's book, which was called UFO Contact at Pascagoula, and it was co-authored by a chap called William Mendez. So while I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, I wonder what Calvin makes of this. I know Charles Hickson had passed away, but I didn't know. I was led to believe that Calvin was still alive. So I started to try and track him down just to get an interview, nothing more. And it took me about 3 months, and I eventually got an email for him. And lo and behold, it was still active, and he replied. And eventually he gave me his phone number, and he was a bit reticent when I first contacted him on the phone. But he said, Philip, he said, I've been thinking about writing my own book. And he'd written some notes just to give him some ideas. And after a few phone calls and a chat on Skype, he said, he looks like you're the right person at the right time. And we set about writing his book. But Calvin was insistent right from day one that he wanted to write this book in his own words. He wasn't prepared to let me edit things out. He says, I'm an uneducated redneck. I don't mean that in any way. It's just how he describes himself, And he said, I want the book to reflect not just what happened to us, but me as a person as well. And so, we finished the book and we published it. It went on to become a bestseller on Amazon. The media again became interested, and now Calvin wanted to tell his story. He wanted to set the record straight because he hadn't really told the full story. He'd done a number of things that he perhaps shouldn't have done. For example, once when a journalist caught up with him, Calvin thought it was a good idea to give him a story, and told him that it was all the devil, but he just told him that to get rid of him. He realized it was a mistake because he was quoted as being said, you believe it was the devil. No, he doesn't. He just tried that to get rid of this fella. So now he wanted to set the record straight. And one of the things we found out is that in 1993, down in Florida, Calvin had actually went under regressive hypnosis with the late Bud Hopkins.
I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah. Let's get into that. Yeah, that's great.
Well, it was a friend of Calvin's who was interested in the subject, and Calvin was living in Florida at the time, and there was a UFO convention, and it was his friend. So why don't we go and have a chat with Bud Hopkins? So his friend persuaded him, and eventually they persuaded Calvin to undergo regressive hypnosis, which he did. That lasted for about 90 minutes. And, of course, Bud had since passed away. So I said to Calvin, was it recorded? He said, yeah. So I asked who had taken care of Bud's archive of material, and it had been handed to Dr. David Jacobs. I emailed Dr. Jacobs, and I said, do you have the tape in question? And lo and behold, he had it. He knew where to find it as well. And within 10 days of asking him, I had a copy on my desk.
Oh, that's good that he was amenable to letting you hear it.
Absolutely. And, I asked permission. He'd only release it to me if Calvin said it was okay, which he did. And I transcribed it. And it's fascinating. It really is. It was a bit difficult at the time because Bud was a New Yorker. So I've got a New Yorker asking the questions, and then I've got Calvin from Mississippi giving the answers. And of course, there were some of the slang words that I have never heard before. They're not offensive; they're just slang words.
Right.
Calvin talked about the car having a tag on it. I had no idea what a tag was. Well, it's the thing on the number plate which tells you which where you're from.
Right.
From which state you're from. And
maybe I can help you with that if you still need a little bit of a deciphering of.
Well, what was interesting though, when he was fully conscious, Calvin will tell you the story. If they drove in, they passed a car on the way. He can even tell you what make and model the car was. However, under hypnosis, he even gave us the number plate, what the number was. And he recalled that this man got out of the car and had a look around and got back in and drove away. So, that's in the book. I mean, even Calvin had never heard that tape. He asked, apparently Bud put a hypnotic suggestion in there whereby Calvin couldn't remember it. So he was oblivious to it himself.
I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a question I was going to ask you, that he apparently had no recollection of what took place during the hypnosis session with Hopkins. But in addition, Philip, isn't it true that he talked about an episode of missing time during the regression itself?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
talk about that.
One of the things that Bud asks is, has anything like this happened before or after? And one of the things, there's a number of things, but one of the things that Calvin talked about was he went fishing one day. I mean, he's fishing mad, but he's got a little boat. And this day he was only going fishing literally for a couple of hours. And he knows it was for a couple of hours by the provisions he'd take with him. He wouldn't take any food, he'd just take some water to drink. He says, if I was going out fishing longer, I would take, a packed lunch and so on. His wife knew where he was going, so he drove there, got in the boat, off he goes. It's a lovely day. And he's lay there looking up, and there's a cloud, and the cloud opens. And then the next thing he remembers, it's dark. So he goes back to shore. There's his car, and his wife had actually been out to find out what had happened to him, because he was late. And she'd left a note under his windscreen wipers saying, Calvin, where are you? So that came out under hypnosis as well, and other things. I mean, one of the things, but I said, keep this. One of the creatures that Calvin describes, again, it's not described by Charlie Hickson. It's just described by Calvin. And I told you about these strange creatures, that, with the pincer-like hands. But there was Calvin talks about this other creature coming in, and he thinks it was a female. Why he thinks it was a female, it was nothing visually, although she did look, I'm saying it looked different. It was just, an impression he got that this was a female, and there was aggression between the two. I mean, Calvin says under hypnosis, he just wanted to kill her, in no uncertain terms. And he gets really angry, and I mean, none of this was remembered consciously at all. He can now, because he's heard the tape, he's read the transcript, and it's all come flooding back to him, and he just calls the other creatures the ugly ones.
And there were three, weren't there? If I
there was
recall,
three. Yeah,
okay,
two got hold of Charlie Hickson, and one got hold of Calvin, and he just called. I mean, they were all ugly, So he calls the others the ugly ones. But there was this aggressive interaction between Calvin and this female creature. For one, I'll call it a creature of a different gender.
Okay.
And it goes back in time as well to when he was a young boy, still living at home, and he shared a room with his brother. I mean, Calvin idolized his brother as well. And he said his brother would get upset at night when in inverted commas, the ghosts would come. And of course, Calvin is saying it wasn't really the ghost. Yeah. It was one of these things. And his brother used to say, the ghost is whispering in my ear, Calvin. Get it to stop.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's all this mixed in with it as well, and a lot more.
I want to talk about that. This is perfect. Thank you. You're so lucid in the way you're articulating the story so brilliantly. Let's talk, Philip, a little bit about the intergenerational link, because I know that Calvin mentioned that not only his brother, but his mother, if I'm not mistaken, had craft sightings. Now, I've talked about this whole idea of an intergenerational link with Mary Rodwell in great detail throughout several of our interviews. Others, like Carla Turner, the late researcher who suspected that her abductions were tied to family members as well as Calvin. Now, I don't know that he went into whether both his mother and brother were unequivocally contactees. But it would seem to me, or it's certainly worth the question, had they had craft sightings, is there any reason to suspect that they may have been abductees or experiencers as well? Let's talk about that. Calvin's story, the intergenerational link, if there is such a thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is interesting because, again, when we look at Charlie Hickson claimed to have a number of contacts on his own after the initial event, but then there was an incident where the whole family were involved, literally the whole lot of them. Yeah. They'd been to I think it was Mother's Day. I think they'd been out to see his mum, and they were driving back, and Charlie became what we'd probably call a contactee. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to get out of the car because this thing was coming into land, and he wanted to go with them. He said, "This is the time. This is the time for whatever reason for me to go with them." But his family stopped him, and he claimed he had a message saying there'll be another time. So again, like I said, when I was reading the original book, I'm thinking, I wonder if anything like this happened to Calvin. And of course I got the chance to ask him, and he told me about family sightings. Then when we had the tape, we had things going back in time to when he was a young boy. And I don't think there's any definitive answer on this. I mean, a number of researchers believe or claim that the evidence that they've uncovered does tend to suggest that whatever these encounters are, they're not just a one-off.
Right. That
they happen from when you're young.
Absolutely.
Right the way through your adult life and so on. Mm-hmm. And, mm-hmm. With your offspring or other family members as well. But then there are those that claim, well, there are instances where it is just a one-off. Yeah. And we find no evidence of anything before or after. So it's still an area of research, I think, that is still ongoing.
That could be explored, more.
Yeah, because I think in the early days, someone would come forward with an account, and we'd listen to it, and we'd document it, and we would never ask the question, has anything happened to you like this previously? We'd just probably take on board what had happened to them at that point. And I think it's only other researchers then got hints that perhaps there was something else, like Bud Hopkins, like Dr. David Jacobs and Carla Turner and others, that were thinking, hang on a minute, hold on. They may have had one case that did have these links, so they then thought, well, I better ask others. I'm not going to lead them. I'm not going to ask a leading question. I'm just going to see if there's anything else. And when you listen to the Bud Hopkins tape, you can see he's trying his damnedest not to offer leading questions.
Right.
And let Calvin just tell his story. And so it's still an area of research that I think is still ongoing, and one that will play out at some point or another, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. I think that's an integral puzzle piece because, I mean, again, going back to if what is happening, you and I were speaking offline about this idea that this could perhaps be more of a mass phenomenon that we know. What are the global implications for that? Once we discover that this is far more ubiquitous than we know, including an intergenerational component, including what Grant Cameron refers to as lifers. His very, very adamant belief is that if you have had one contact experience, you are a, quote, lifer. I actually just posed that question to Rich Dolan, another colleague of ours who was on the show a few weeks ago, as to whether he believes there's any teeth to that. And again, I think that there's a spectrum where you may have a significant amount of individuals who have had multiple contact experiences. You may have others that have what we call one-offs.
Well, I'll give you an example, Alexis. Calvin's just been interviewed for a documentary, but it's not about him. The producer approached him because he's dealing with a lady in Mississippi who's had these strange blue lights in her house, and they've terrified her, and she won't live there. Now, at the beginning of Calvin's encounter, the first thing they saw were blue lights, because they'd gone. They shouldn't really have been fishing. There was no entry sign. They shouldn't have been there. So Calvin naturally thought, this is the police. Of course, when they turned around, it wasn't the police. So he took the opportunity to interview Calvin. He went to Calvin's house and spent a few hours there. But one of the questions he asked Calvin, is there anything this lady can do? Because it scared the living daylights out of her. And Calvin says no. I think he was looking for some reassuring words from Calvin to say, yeah, if you do this, or if you don't, that'll be the end of it. But he said, no, basically, there's nothing you can do.
That's very...
He used, how can I say this? A language that was a bit stronger than that.
Oh, I think we can use our imagination. Yeah. But hearing that has got to be, my gosh, so disheartening. What do you mean there's nothing I can do? And yet and
he was just being honest.
And this was a recent situation of this individual, this woman seeing the blue lights in her home?
Oh, absolutely, yes, okay. Absolutely. And she has moved out of the house, apparently. And, I think the gentleman was just... thought, well, Calvin's in the region. He saw blue lights as well. Mm-hmm. He's now come out of the woodwork, so to speak. So I'll take the advantage of trying to speak to him if I can. And Calvin agreed. And he looked for some reassuring words. And Calvin said, no, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah. Well,
that's it.
From his perspective, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Philip, do you think there's any specific criteria that these beings look for when choosing who they're going to, quote, abduct?
Well, that's been a question that's been asked down the decades.
I know,
Alexis. I mean, again,
you got 4 decades, and so you got to give me something here.
Well, I had a colleague of mine, again, sadly no longer with us, called Ken Phillips, and he worked with a psychologist called I think it was Dr. Alexander Coyle. I can't pronounce it, but he was a European guy, and they didn't look about what you would say about your encounter. They looked at you, you as an individual. And I had a whole battery of questions about people who had close encounters to see if there was something why what would make you have such an experience, whether these experiences were external or internal or whatever. But they weren't really interested in the theories about what these encounters may or may not be. They were looking to see if there was anything as you as an individual. And, that was a study that was ongoing that didn't really come to any conclusions. I mean, my first book that I wrote was called Without Consent. I wrote it with a colleague of mine called Carl Negatis. Carl was a long-standing Fleet Street journalist of some repute at the time. And one of the things we tried to do when we were interviewing, I drove up and down the country interviewing people face to face, was to see if there was anything that would connect these individuals. And we couldn't find anything. It seemed that they were just random. As far as we could see, they were about their daily tasks, about just going about life in general, driving home from work. One lady was in the fields picking wildflowers with her daughter. Another chap was on his way to meet his girlfriend. Nothing that we could find. There was complete age difference. However, there were some omissions as far as the UK is concerned. And that we have areas in the UK where they have large populations of people from Asia. From Pakistan, India, parts of the Commonwealth. I don't ever recollect speaking to an Asian person who'd had one of these encounters. I may be wrong now. I don't know. There was other omissions. I don't ever remember speaking, and I know this is very rare in the population, but speaking to someone who was deaf or blind who'd had such an encounter. Again, I don't know. It may be just because that is still, thankfully, such a rarity within the population. But there were certainly things that we thought that should be there that weren't. For example, the second largest city in the UK is Birmingham. That's where my That's how I become to be, because my mum and dad met in Birmingham after the war. So I have a connection with the city. And it has, again, a large black population. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have many people from that area report this type of thing, if any.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We couldn't find anything, but there seemed to be things that we thought we should find that weren't there.
This is coming up a lot, and I'm smiling, obviously. Well, I shouldn't say obviously. I am smiling because it has come up in it questioned me as an African-American woman, not just insofar as the contact experience, how common or uncommon it may be in certain cultures, but basically what we're talking about here. Are they choosing certain profiles? You bring up something amazing, and I think what you're doing is through process of elimination, you may be putting together a profile of who's more apt to be an abductee than not, in terms of being deaf individuals with loss of sight, etc. And yet I would dare say those are in there as well. This is a big subject that we're talking about now, particularly having to do with cultures that are having contact experiences.
I have friends who are, of Asian descent. Zafran and Idris are good friends of mine. And they know of my interest in this subject, and they're both of the Muslim faith. Mm-hmm. And again, not too far from where I live, we have big Asian communities. I've been there, worked there, and you would expect to have a sprinkling of people of Asian origin mm-hmm. in amongst the abductees, but
right.
I'm not saying there aren't any. It's just that I never came across any.
Right.
Things may have changed since then. I don't know, because we do know, for example, that within certain Asian communities, they are reluctant to talk about things anyway.
I was just going to say there may in fact be an inhibition that I think that definitely plays a role. I think there are a number of factors. The people that are talking about abduction experiences versus those that are having them, and those that can recall them. And that's a big one, as you and I spoke about offline. So very, very, very interesting indeed, and is worthy of many more years of research.
What was also interesting, Alexis, although we didn't publish this, when Carl and I had finished the book Without Consent, there was a small number of those that actually featured in the book. And I just sent them all the same questionnaire. And it was only, a few lines. Didn't have to put their names on them. Their name didn't matter. But it was, what did they believe was the nature and origin of their experience? And it was amazing. Some thought definitely from ET. Others thought this was a spiritual experience. Mm. Others had no idea. One young man, he thought it was the Russians. He didn't. He blamed the Russians because when this happened to him, the Russians were the bad guys, so we'll blame it on them. It was just a way of rationalizing it for him. But even the people who had these experiences themselves didn't, all agree on what the nature and origin of was. Right. And I found that interesting as well.
Yeah. I would imagine there has to be a broad range of interpretation, and really we're left with nothing but interpretation. Will we ever see the experience for what it is?
Here's a little thing we did find out, and it's not definitive, Alexis, but it seemed as a residue or something, a side effect you might want to call it, is that a number of these people had an artistic or spiritual awakening after the event. For example, they would become interested in environmental issues, mm-hmm. or they would develop an interest in some kind of art, or have artistic skills that they didn't have before. The one young man who I told you about, who thought he was the Russians, he was a typical young guy. He reminded of me when I was his age. He had long hair, wore the denims, liked his rock music. And he started writing spontaneous poetry, and I had to swear an oath at the time not to tell any of his friends that he was writing poetry. All of these things they claimed were linked back to their experience, that these didn't happen before it.
Right.
So that was just an interesting little thing that cropped up. Now, whether that's the same for everyone, I would doubt it.
I would doubt it. Yeah.
It was just an interesting little side effect, I think.
Yeah. It's come up in a number of other works, including, I'm thinking of Miguel Mendonça, a newer individual researcher in this field who's written several books, including Meet the Hybrids, in which he interviewed 8 individuals who he believes to be, or they believe to be themselves part human, part non-human. And what's prominent in all of their cases of discovering that they were not only having contact experience, but may in fact be hybrids, are their artistic abilities that come out in myriad forms. So yeah, for sure. I'm looking at this clock, and I want to make sure we get to another one of your brilliant works, and I'm determined to fit that in. But I want to ask one more question about on the Calvin story, which is absolutely fascinating. We're going to have to try to get him on at some point if he's agreeable to do so. I want to talk a little bit about Calvin's philosophy about what's going on right now, because I think that's very interesting. And this may have something to do with why he was quite adamant about getting his story out at this time. This relates to his individual experience with mass consciousness. He said that he has a feeling that we're going to have to face some realizations about these non-humans sooner than later, and that they may be living side by side with us right now. Philip, do you agree with his assessment? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's not easy to disagree. I mean, this is the man who has faced the phenomenon, face to face, up close and personal, as we tried to do many years previously, but sadly failed. And I think if you ask Calvin openly, he'll call these creatures aliens. But he says at the end of the day, I don't really know what they were. I know what they weren't, And I think he has speculated and wondered what the nature and origin of his experience was, and his thoughts on that may have changed down the years. But now he's a much older, much wiser person, and he's at peace with it now. I think that's the way I can describe it. It's almost like this thing was following him, and by publishing his book, telling his story, that's gone. He no longer has to look over his shoulder.
Very cathartic. Yeah,
absolutely.
Wow, that's great.
And he's actually grateful for it, and it's changed his viewpoint. It's changed his life. It gives him time to look back on what has happened. And he's not a great scholar of the UFO subject by any stroke of the imagination. I don't think he'd be able to tell you, many books. He's met a few personalities down the years, but he's not that interested in the subject in general.
Right, which is interesting in and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and he is of the opinion that the day will come when it will no longer be you and I chatting about it. It will be accepted by everyone. I know there's literally nothing that everyone accepts, but it will no longer be an underground, genre, so to speak. It will be an accepted phenomenon, whatever that may be. And whether it be in his lifetime or not, he doesn't know, but he's sure the day is coming.
I agree with him, actually. And I think that I can't certainly speak for everyone in this field, but I'm sure many of us that do the work that we do are doing it based on that as an objective. So I certainly hope that's the case. And I have a feeling we're getting closer. We just don't know when. So your work has certainly been integral in that regard. And it's just, again, I want to just take my hats off to you because you've just done stellar work. This has just been so enjoyable talking with you, and I know our audience will enjoy it. And speaking of your work, Philip Mantle, let's talk about your work. Obviously, with Calvin, putting out his story has garnered plenty of attention in the last several months more. You've got a whole catalog in addition of equally intriguing works. Some of these books you've authored yourself and some written by others. But I want to talk about your book for our closing minutes, Once Upon a Missing Time. And this was released at the beginning of this year, I believe in March. Is that true?
Yeah, well, okay. It's a re-release. I mean, it's a novel.
It's a re-release. Okay. Talk about that a little bit. This is intriguing.
it's a novel on alien abductions. All the characters in it are actually real people, although I have changed their names and their occupations. And as I mentioned earlier, my first book was called Without Consent, which deals entirely with missing time and abduction accounts from the UK only. Nowhere else, just the UK. I think it's still the only book that's ever done that. Now, when I wrote Without Consent, I still literally have all the files next to me for that particular book, paper files. So they were all still there, and I had all these stories in my head. So I wrote the novel, Once Upon a Missing Time, which is actually based on Without Consent. So there are pieces of individual missing time or abduction cases taken from the non-fiction book and turned into a work of fiction. And like I said, all the people in it are real people whom I know. They're not just characters I've made up. And I set it in the Yorkshire Dales, where I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Again, there was a time when we had a lot of sightings there, so it just made sense to me to do that. And it is about a family, the Morrisons, mum and dad, and a daughter at school, and the fictional story is as much about them as what happened to them and how they deal with it and how people around them deal with it. For example, one of the things was you've had this experience. Who do you talk to about it? And they talk to their family about it and get the family's not that interested really, and how it affects their daughter at school and so on. And so it's for me, I try to paint the phenomena in the correct positive light, and also how some people struggle to cope with it.
Yeah.
And again, there is no Ghostbusters. You can't call Ghostbusters because this thing has happened.
Right. That's for sure.
What help can you get? Who do you turn to? And of course, in the end, they turn to a UFO researcher. Some people believe that the character of the UFO researcher is me. It's not based on me, but who in turn tries to bring in outside help from a psychologist and so on. So there's, you get academia involved in it, who are quite skeptical. So it tells a very positive story at the end, and they do manage to cope. But then, like all good novels, they leave it in a cliffhanger that something else. As we talked about, these things continuing and not being a one-off. So I'll leave it with the fact that something else is just about to happen, and leave it there. And as we mentioned off air, I sold the film rights to it earlier this year. Whether it'll ever get made into a movie or not is a different matter. But it was nice that somebody thought it was worthy of that in the first place. But
I think it probably. I have a feeling it probably will. This just in your synopsis of it sounds completely intriguing.
Well, it's what we try to do with Without Consent, because we try to show that these people who have these experiences are not round the twist. They are just ordinary, everyday people. It could be your next door neighbour. Yeah. It could be your brother or your sister, and they were just about their normal, everyday tasks, going to meet friends, going out for work, at leisure, whatever, when these things happened, completely out of the blue, without any warning, and so on. So we did that Without Consent, although in Without Consent we looked at we mixed in a few other possible theories. We didn't follow any, but we tried to show it that because in those days the media would have you believe that these individuals are looking for attention. These things always happen in an out of the way place and there's nobody else around, which is difficult to do in Britain because, as you know, Alexis, we're only a tiny little place.
Right.
But of course, none of that was true. I mean, one of those in the book was a police constable in his patrol car at the time on duty, and that was PC Alan Godfrey. He's a little side story for you. You know the film about Travis Walton, Fire in the Sky?
Of course, yes.
Well, the producers had two movies. They're looking at two, one of two, and the other option was Police Constable Alan Godfrey. They actually came and met Alan and even made a little promo of the movie, but they chose Travis Walton instead. So, and of course, PC Alan Godfrey just published his own book, actually. He's in my book, Without Consent, and he was on duty at the time in the patrol car. So that's just a little story.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
How things are so tightly intertwined. Fascinating. You have been fascinating from beginning to end, and I'm looking at the clock. We're going to have to cut it off. But speaking of cliffhangers, let's make this one, because I'd like to do a show perhaps just on this idea of missing time, because it seems to be so integral to the contact phenomenon. Certainly not, all of the time, but enough that it's worthy for discussion. So would you come back and talk to us about that in your great book more?
Oh, absolutely, Alexis. I'd be delighted.
That would be phenomenal. This has been a treat, and I mean that. Although we had originally planned to meet when I was over in the UK a couple of months ago, and I was sad that I couldn't meet you. I'm just delighted that we finally had a chance to get together. So, and I'm sure it will not be the last time. So before we close, tell us where people can find your incredible catalog of work and also your Facebook page. I think by the way, you've got a really cool Facebook banner at the top. I just went over to the Facebook page. Everyone, you got to go over there and see it. Almost a little trailer in and of itself as the banner. But tell us where we can find your work on your main website.
Yeah, it's just, if you just put Flying Disc Press into Google, you'll find me. I think I'm the only one. So
Flying Disc Press.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got a little blog and all the books are on there.
Oh, you've got a ton of stuff. It's a treat. Go there, everyone. We'll make sure to have a link that you can go right there. And as I said, go to that Facebook page and check out what he did with his, I'm calling it the Facebook trailer. It's phenomenal. Well, listen, Philip Mantle, what an honor and a pleasure to have you on, and you keep up the fight, because I have a feeling you will continue to be integral in turning this into something that's fringe and subculture to something that's mainstream. I think we're getting there. Thanks in part to you. So thanks again.
My pleasure, Alexis.